In the spring of 1889, a man named George Tillman was digging a drainage trench behind what remained of the old slave quarters on his family's property in Edgefield County, South Carolina. His shovel hit something solid at roughly 2 feet down. He assumed it was a root. He worked around it. Then his shovel came down again, and he heard a sound that was not the sound of wood or stone or clay. It was a hollow metallic ring, the sound of something sealed and empty inside. He stopped digging. He got down on his knees in the South Carolina dirt and began moving soil with his hands. What he pulled out was a box. Iron, roughly the size of a large Bible, sealed with a lock that had rusted almost completely through. The box had been wrapped in what appeared to have once been oilcloth, most of it decomposed now, but enough remaining to suggest that someone had taken considerable care to protect whatever was inside from the moisture of the earth. The lock broke off in Tillman's hand when he applied pressure to it. The box had been in the ground long enough that the metal itself had weakened. He opened it in the field, kneeling in the dirt with no one watching. Inside were documents, papers, folded carefully, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth that had survived better than the outer wrapping. Tillman unfolded the first one carefully, aware that the paper was fragile. He was not a particularly educated man, but he could read, and what he read on that first page stopped him so completely that he remained kneeling in the field for nearly 20 minutes before he was able to stand up. He never told anyone what the box contained. Not his wife, not his brother, not the county clerk in Edgefield. He took the box to his house, placed it in the back of a wardrobe, and left it there for 11 years. When he died in 1901, his wife found the box while clearing his belongings and brought it to their son, a man named Robert Tillman, who had received more education than his father, and who read the documents with a growing expression of disbelief that his own children, watching from the doorway, would remember for the rest of their lives. Robert Tillman contacted a historian at the University of South Carolina named Dr. Evelyn Marsh in 1902. Dr. Marsh arrived at the Tillman property 3 days later. She spent 6 hours with the documents that first day and returned for more times over the following month. What she eventually published in a monograph in 1904, a publication that received almost no attention at the time and was not rediscovered by scholars until 1978, was a reconstruction of one of the most carefully concealed acts of documentation in the history of American slavery. The box had been buried sometime between 1855 and 1861. Dr. Marsh established this through the dates on the documents themselves and through the condition of the oilcloth wrapping. Someone on the Hargrove plantation in Edgefield County had buried that box deliberately, had wrapped its contents carefully to preserve them, and had placed it in the ground beneath the floor of the slave quarters with a specific intention that it would survive, that it would be found, that what was inside it would eventually reach people who could do something with it. The Hargrove plantation had been one of the largest cotton operations in Edgefield County before the war, covering nearly 4,000 acres and holding, at its peak in the late 1850s, over 90 enslaved people. Its owner, a man named Cornelius Hargrove, had died in 1871 without heirs, and the property had passed through several hands before portions of it were sold off and eventually acquired by the Tillman family in 1878. By the time George Tillman dug his drainage trench in 1889, the original slave quarters had been standing empty for over 20 years, slowly returning to the earth. The person who buried the box had been standing on ground that no longer existed in any meaningful sense when it was finally found. And yet what they had buried had survived perfectly. The oilcloth had done its work. The question that Dr. Marsh could not stop asking herself in the weeks following her first examination of the documents was not what the box contained. She knew that by the end of the first day. The question was who had buried it, who on the Hargrove plantation in the 1850s had possessed both the knowledge to compile what was in that box and the foresight to understand that preserving it was worth the extraordinary risk of being caught doing so. Before we go further, drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. If you are new here, subscribe and hit the bell, because the answer to that question is the most remarkable part of this story. And what was inside that box will change everything you thought you knew about who kept records in the antebellum South and why. The documents in the box fell into 3 categories. Dr. Marsh spent the first week simply cataloging them, handling each one with the care of someone who understands that what she is touching is irreplaceable. There were 14 documents in total, each one folded separately, each one wrapped individually in a smaller piece of oilcloth before being placed together in the iron box. Whoever had done this had not been in a hurry. The wrapping was meticulous. Every fold was deliberate. The first category was financial records. Specifically, copies of financial records, written in a hand that was careful and precise, recording transactions that Cornelius Hargrove had conducted between 1848 and 1857. These were not copies of legitimate plantation business. They were copies of a second set of accounts, a shadow ledger, that Hargrove had maintained separately from his official records. The shadow ledger documented income and expenditure that did not appear anywhere in the official accounts filed with the county. Money received for transactions that were, by the laws of South Carolina, even in 1857, fraudulent. Land transfers conducted under false names. The sale of people across state lines in ways that violated even the limited legal requirements that existed. Payments made to officials whose names appeared in full, with dates and amounts, in language so specific that Dr. Marsh immediately understood why Hargrove had kept this ledger private, and equally understood how catastrophically dangerous it would have been for whoever copied it to be caught doing so. Because these were copies. The original shadow ledger had belonged to Hargrove. Someone had read it, memorized it, or taken notes, and then reproduced its contents in their own hand, accurately enough that Dr. Marsh, who spent 2 weeks cross-referencing the copies against surviving county records, found them consistent with everything verifiable from other sources. Whoever had made these copies had not simply transcribed numbers. They had understood what they were transcribing. They had known which transactions were fraudulent and why. They had selected, from whatever material was available to them, exactly the information that would be most damaging if it reached the right hands. The second category was testimony. 7 separate accounts, each one written in a different hand, each one describing specific events that had occurred on the Hargrove plantation between 1845 and 1858. The events described were acts of violence, specific and detailed, with dates, names of perpetrators, names of victims, and in several cases the names of white witnesses who had been present and said nothing. These were not vague allegations. They were precise descriptions of incidents that had never been reported to any authority, could not have been reported under the legal structure of antebellum South Carolina, and that had been recorded here with a specificity that could only have come from people who had been present or who had spoken directly with those who were. 7 different hands, 7 different accounts. Someone had collected them, had gone from person to person among the enslaved community of the Hargrove plantation, and had asked them to write down, or had written down for them, what they had witnessed and experienced. In a world where enslaved people were legally prohibited from testifying against white people in court, someone had created a record of testimony that existed outside any legal framework, preserved not for immediate use, but for a future when the framework itself might be different. The third category was the one that stopped Dr. Marsh entirely when she first encountered it. A single document, longer than the others, written in the same careful hand that had copied the financial records. It was a list, names, ages, family relationships, and in many cases places of origin, for every enslaved person on the Hargrove plantation between 1845 and 1858. 93 names in total, recorded with completeness that the official plantation records did not come close to matching. Cornelius Hargrove's records listed his enslaved people by first name only, age, and assessed value. This document gave them surnames. It gave them parents and children and siblings. It gave them the names of family members who had been sold away and the approximate dates of those sales. It gave them, in several cases, the names of the plantations they had been sold to. It was a record of people as people, complete, specific, and created at a time when the creation of such a record was itself an act of resistance so dangerous that its author had thought it necessary to seal it in an iron box and bury it in the ground. Dr. Marsh spent 3 weeks trying to identify the author before she found what she was looking for in a source she had not initially considered relevant. The Edgefield County records of free people of color, maintained inconsistently, but not entirely absent, contain an entry from 1849 for a man named Solomon, described as a free black man working as a scrivener, meaning a professional copyist, employed by various Edgefield County businesses for document work. The entry noted that Solomon had been born enslaved on a plantation in Virginia, had been manumitted in 1841 by his owner's will and had moved to Edgefield County in 1843. A free black man, a professional copyist, working in Edgefield County in the years when the documents in the box were created. Dr. Marsh cross-referenced. She found Solomon's name in the records of 3 Edgefield County businesses that had used his services for legitimate document work between 1843 and 1858. She found a reference to him in a letter written by a local merchant in 1851, describing him as a man of unusual skill and complete reliability. She found in the records of the Edgefield County Sheriff from 1859 a single entry noting that a free black man named Solomon Scrivener had left the county without notifying the authorities as required by law, and that his whereabouts were unknown. He had disappeared in 1859, 2 years after the last dated document in the box. 1 to 2 years, Dr. Marsh estimated, before someone buried the box beneath the slave quarters floor. Someone else had buried it. Solomon had created the documents, and then he had left, or been forced to leave, or had run, and someone who remained had taken what he created and hidden it in the ground where it would survive. Who had buried it? That question led Dr. Marsh to the most unexpected corner of this entire story. The answer to who buried the box came not from the documents inside it, but from the box itself. Dr. Marsh had been so focused on the contents during her first weeks of examination that she had paid relatively little attention to the container. It was only during her 4th visit to the Tillman property, when she asked to examine the box more carefully in good daylight, that she noticed what had been on the underside of the lid the entire time. Scratched into the iron, shallow enough that it was easy to miss against the rust and corrosion, but clear once you knew to look for it, were 2 initials and a date. H. 1861. H. Dr. Marsh went back to the list of names in the documents, the 93 people recorded by Solomon with their full names and family relationships. She found 3 people whose names began with those initials. She eliminated 2 of them based on age. One was an infant in 1861, and one was an elderly man listed as infirm. The third was a woman named Esther Hargrove, listed in Solomon's record as approximately 35 years old in 1858, occupation house servant. Family notation indicating she had one surviving child, a daughter named May, and that a husband named James had been sold to a Mississippi plantation in 1852. Esther Hargrove, house servant, the same surname as Cornelius Hargrove, which in the context of antebellum South Carolina carried its own devastating implication about her origins and her relationship to the man who owned her. Dr. Marsh found Esther in Cornelius Hargrove's official records, listed consistently from 1845 onward as a house servant assigned to domestic duties in the main house. She had, in other words, worked inside the house where Cornelius Hargrove kept his records. She had been present in the rooms where the shadow ledger existed. She had watched and listened for years with a particular invisible attention of someone who understands that what the powerful say in front of the powerless reveals everything, precisely because the powerful do not consider the powerless worth guarding against. She had told Solomon what she knew. She had helped collect the testimony of the others. And when Solomon left in 1859, she had kept the documents he created. And in 1861, as the world around her began to shift in ways that were not yet legible, but that she perhaps sensed more clearly than the people who owned her, she had sealed those documents in an iron box, wrapped them in oilcloth, and buried them in the ground beneath the slave quarters floor. She had scratched her initials into the lid. She had wanted someone to know who had put it there. Dr. Marsh found Esther Hargrove in the post-war records. She was listed in the 1870 census for Edgefield County, age listed as approximately 47, occupation laundress, living with a daughter named May, age listed as 22. She had survived. She had stayed in Edgefield County through the war, through emancipation, through the chaos of Reconstruction, and she was there in 1870, living and working 11 years after she had sealed a box and put in the ground. She had not seen the box opened. She had not been there in 1889, when George Tillman's shovel hit iron 2 feet down. She had died, the census record suggests, sometime in the mid-1870s, before the box was found, before anyone knew what she had buried. Her daughter May appears in the Edgefield County records through 1891, 3 years after the box was found. Whether May knew about the box, whether Esther had told her, whether the knowledge had been passed down in the family and simply not reached anyone who connected it to the discovery, Dr. Marsh was never able to establish. May Hargrove left Edgefield County sometime in the early 1890s, and her trail after that point becomes difficult to follow in the available records. What Dr. Marsh published in 1904 was largely ignored. The monograph appeared in a small academic journal with limited circulation in a year when the country had very little appetite for detailed examinations of antebellum financial fraud and violence. The Hargrove family, such members as still existed, were not prominent enough for the revelations about Cornelius Hargrove's shadow ledger to generate public interest. The testimony documents were noted as historically significant, but were not pursued legally, which would in any case have been impossible given that everyone named in them was long dead. The list of 93 names was acknowledged as remarkable, but not followed up on in any systematic way. The monograph sat in archives for 74 years. In 1978, a graduate student at the University of South Carolina named Thomas Reeves came across a reference to it while researching something else entirely. He tracked down the original and read it in a single sitting. He spent the next 4 years verifying Dr. Marsh's work, locating the original documents, which had been donated to the South Carolina Historical Society by Robert Tillman's estate in 1923, and expanding her research using genealogical methods and county records that had become more accessible in the intervening decades. What Reeves found, we began tracing the 93 names on Solomon's list, was that the list was accurate. Every name he was able to verify independently checked out. The family relationships were correct. The sale records matched. The names of the plantations where people had been sent matched surviving records from those properties. Solomon had not been guessing or approximating. He had recorded 93 people with a precision that the official records of the Hargrove plantation never approached. Reeves also found descendants. Not all of them, not most of them, but some. People living in South Carolina, in Georgia, in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Illinois, who carried the surnames on Solomon's list and whose family histories, when traced, connected back to the Hargrove plantation in Edgefield County. People had grown up knowing that their great-great-grandparents had been enslaved somewhere in South Carolina without knowing where specifically, without knowing the names that connected them to a particular piece of ground. The list gave them that. A document created in secret, buried in the ground for 30 years. Ignored for 74 more, had survived long enough to give people their own history back. The iron box is held today in the collection of the South Carolina Historical Society in Charleston. The documents inside are preserved in acid-free folders and have been digitized and made available to researchers. The oilcloth wrapping, too fragile to be displayed, is stored separately. The box itself, with the initials EH and the date 1861 scratched into the underside of its lid, is displayed in a climate-controlled case. Esther Hargrove scratched those initials into iron with something small and sharp, in a moment that must have required extraordinary steadiness of hand and nerve. She was sealing a box that she had no certainty would ever be found, hiding documents that might never reach anyone. She was doing it anyway, because the alternative was to let those 93 names and the testimony of the 7 witnesses and the evidence of Cornelius Hargrove's fraud disappear into the silence that the plantation system depended on. She chose not to let them disappear. Edgefield County, South Carolina, 1861. A woman sealed a box and put it in the ground. She scratched her initials into the lid so that whoever found it would know who had put it there. Someone found it, and now you know her name. Esther Hargrove, house servant, age approximately 38 in 1861. The woman who buried the truth and trusted the earth to keep it safe until the world was ready to hear it.